Welcome to Parenting Unpacked, a place for parents to seek refuge with evidence, empathy, and common sense. Hosted by Dr. Siobhan Kennedy Costantini and Dr. Kristyn Summer. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Parenting Unpacked. You're here with Siobhan and Kristyn, and today we are tackling all things postpartum anxiety and depression. Welcome, Siobhan. How are you feeling?
I'm good. I'm doing really well. So first up, we want to just give a bit of a trigger warning. As Kristyn just said, we will be covering the topics of postnatal anxiety, depression, PTSD. So there's some heavy stuff that we'll be talking about today. But if you're up to listening to it, amazing. If you're feeling like you're having a bit of a struggling time in your own life, whether or not you're going through it right now and you've got enough on your plate and you want to skip this one, feel free. Feel free to dip in and out as works for you. We are absolutely, our main priority is you looking after your mental well-being. So do what works for you, and we're here for it. We have very similar stories, but there's obviously key points that diverge. So for those of you that don't know, Kristyn and I, we both have one child each, and they're about 2 months different in age.
Yeah, that.
And we had very similar experiences, and we can probably talk a little bit about how we were going through the same thing at the same time, and neither of us, not only did we not quite know what the other was going through, we also didn't really know what we were going through at the time either.
Yeah.
I remember, I've been reflecting a lot on the conversations we had, and it's just, I remember desperation is really a good summary of those conversations.
Yeah, totally. It was a lot. But anyways.
Yeah, let's get into specifics. Let's kind of, rather than dancing around, let's share what we went through and our stories.
Cool. So maybe I'll go first because I think mine is slightly lighter than yours, and it's different. And I think we have slightly different balances of anxiety and depression, because I had massive postpartum anxiety with a hint of depression. And how would you characterize yours, Siobhan?
Yeah, the thing I identify more with is the anxiety.
Yeah.
But the anxiety kind of morphed into really severe trauma, which then turned into, I need to escape this in whatever way that's possible, and then exhibited in kind of ways that are more typically linked with depression.
Right. Okay. So we're very different yet very similar. So I'll start, and then Siobhan can go second. And I think the way I describe it might actually cover a lot of the way you will describe it as well. So let's go. Okay. So the way to understand my postpartum anxiety is actually to understand the antenatal anxiety and depression that I had as well as my entire lifelong challenges with anxiety. Now, not everyone that gets postpartum depression and anxiety has pre-existing anxiety and depression. It is more prevalent in people that have had previous battles of mental health, but you can get it out of the blue as well. It's not uncommon. But for me, I've had anxiety my entire life. So starting in childhood, I had extreme social anxiety. I've always had challenges around things like insomnia and sleep. I was never diagnosed with anything. I think there's a big stigma on mental health, and so my parents didn't really know how to navigate it, but I was bullied profusely throughout school. My mental health as a child was really crappy, and that's no one's fault, but it's just the way that my brain works. But because we had this stigma around mental health and I never got help, I had no idea that all of the ways that I was experiencing life were not typical of a normal child's development. And this carried through not just in childhood, but my teen years and my adulthood. And I went and did a whole degree in psychology, and still only identified as having an anxious kind of personality, not acknowledging that I probably had a generalized anxiety disorder with a bunch of other things as well, because I have a lot of trouble with social interaction. But we'll get into all of that later. So I've always been anxious, and on TikTok, I actually put a video series up about how my anxiety did ruin my wedding, because I had panic attacks, which I didn't realize were panic attacks. I thought that they were food intolerances. And I had panic attacks on my wedding night that meant that I left my wedding for 3 hours, and was curled up in a ball, shivering and feeling like I was going to die. But still, I thought that was a food intolerance, not anxiety, which is great. So fun. Anyways, so fast forward to just after my wedding, I got pregnant, which is, I think, a pretty traditional trajectory. I was lucky. I got pregnant on the second try, which is amazing. And I was just about to finish my PhD. So I submitted my PhD when I was 6 months pregnant. And when you finish a PhD, it's a pretty big transition in life, right? You need to be looking for a job. Generally, you have to leave the country and go somewhere else. And if you don't do that, you're basically committing career suicide, because you can't really get a job, at least not in Australia. It's just not what happens. There's so few jobs in Australia in the academic space. Everyone just leaves the country, and all my friends have left the country. And I got married. I have a husband who's not an academic, and we had just bought a house, and we didn't want to leave the country, and I didn't want to raise my child in a different country on a single postdoc salary, because my husband would have had to give up his job, and I didn't know how I was going to respond to having a baby in my life, whether I was going to go back to work 6 weeks postpartum if I had to take a job.
With a PhD, obviously, when you do a PhD, at least in Australia, it's 3 to 4 years. So you've had a period of time, and I was similar, where you're like, right, undergrad degree, and then postdoc. So you're like, right, great. The next 7 years of my life planned out. Very easy, very straightforward. This is what I do. And then you get to the end of the PhD and you're like, cool, what do I do now? There's no path. In the same way, lots of people experience this, but when you go from such a strict and clear path to it's whatever you choose, it can be really confronting. And then add parenthood on top of that.
Yeah. So it was this really insane change in my life. And motherhood is an insane change in your life, because you are faced with differences in how you're going to manage your work and your life. It's such a big transition. And my personal situation kind of exacerbated that, because I submitted my PhD 6 months pregnant, and I kind of felt this desperate, this plan I've had for my entire life is going down the toilet, because I realized that I'm not going to leave the country. It is a non-negotiable for me. I don't even want to leave the city. I want to raise my daughter near our families. And not everyone feels this way, but this is how I felt. And so I decided that I would sooner give up my career than give up a happy family life. And that made me really sad, and it was pretty dark for me. And so I definitely had a lot of depression, because I felt like I wasn't contributing to my household. I was a research officer, but casually. So I just felt like I wasn't doing everything that needed to be done. And I told my husband that I was just waiting for this baby to come, so I felt useful again.
Yeah. And it makes sense. And it's difficult in terms of societally, you're kind of, the narrative is shifting, but you're kind of told you can have it all. And then when it's very, very clear that you can't have it all, and at least you can't have it all at the same time, when that was your plan, that's really heavy.
Yeah, it was really heavy. And so this transition, I think people call it matrescence. And I think a lot of people understand it as happening when a woman becomes a mother with a baby in her arms, but it happens when a woman even starts thinking about becoming a mother. That transition starts all the way back then. And it can be this really big psychological battle. So I definitely had that experience where I was just waiting to be this perfect mother that I thought I was going to be, because I've always wanted to have kids. And so I went and did a PhD in psychology with the hopes of doing stuff with kids. And then I did an undergraduate in psychology, hoping to do stuff with kids. And I did a PhD on child development, thinking, this is going to set me up to be the perfect mother. And it didn't, definitely didn't. And so, yeah, I had that. And then I also had my same massive anxiety that I've always had in my life, but just worse, because now I had this baby in my belly that I truly believed was never going to arrive. Right up until the moment she was in my arms, I thought that she was going to die. That was
based on just the idea that if I don't hope it, was it protective? It sounds counterintuitive, but this idea that if I don't think she's going to come, then hopefully she will.
Yeah, so it was definitely if I don't get my expectations up, I can't get hurt. And I used to say it all the time. And just remember that first 12 weeks, I was like, I'm not going to make it through this first 12 weeks. It's not going to happen. I truly didn't believe that I would end up with a baby in my arms until she was in my arms. And even then, I didn't think she'd stay. And that was a big red flag for me now, that I had some serious anxiety and mental health issues, because normal people don't do that. Like, there is some doubt, but not every day waking up thinking like this baby isn't here anymore. So yeah, I had antenatal and postnatal anxiety and depression. So we'll just start there. Okay, so where are we? We're now fast forwarding to having my daughter. I had a really normal birth. It was longer. It was overnight. My contractions were like really inconsistent. And I eventually had an epidural, but it was all fine. And I had a vacuum delivery because my OB wanted to protect my pelvic floor. And I still am stoked that she was that smart, because my pelvic floor is perfect after pushing for an hour and a half. It's fine. So the birth was fine. I grabbed my own daughter under her arms and pulled her onto my chest. Like, I delivered my own child. But as soon as she was out, it was hell. The moment she came out, the hormones hit me like a wave crashing over me. Like, I couldn't connect. I didn't feel any bond. I just had this baby on my chest screaming at me, and all I could do was like try not to fall asleep with this baby on my chest.
Did you expect the bond? Like, did you go in imagining this magical moment?
I did not. And that's because I didn't feel that bond the entire time I was pregnant, because I didn't believe that she was going to be in my arms. So I didn't expect the bond. And because of my challenges with social interaction and the way I relate to people, I couldn't have imagined it either. Like, don't get me wrong, I love my husband, but I still don't feel huge feelings about things. I don't have those big things that people sing about and write movies about and things like that. That's not how I experience the world. So I didn't expect it. And it didn't happen. And it was just this wave of hormones, and like, I didn't know it at the time, but I do know it now. My thoughts were immediately dark. I was like, this is awful. Is she breathing? Because she came out not breathing. But like, not crying, but crying and breathing are kind of intrinsically linked, and it took her a while to like start crying. And yeah, it was just dark, very quickly. And I remember we eventually, like, after a few hours of being in the birth suite, just with the baby screaming on my chest, I went to go have my first shower, and in my head, all I could think was, I can never do this again. I will never be able to do this again. This is hell. Like, I feel horrible. Like,
did you feel like you'd made a mistake?
No, I didn't feel like I made a mistake. I didn't regret it, but I definitely felt like I was originally in my head thinking, I'm going to have 2 kids and I'm going to have them like a couple of years apart, whatever, like everyone does. And then I was like, I can never do this again. Like, my body, my brain, my dark thoughts. So it wasn't necessarily that my body hurt that much. It did hurt and I was tired, but I know now how dark and negative my thoughts were. And that was the hormone crash post-birth. Like, a lot of people get the golden hour where they're like on a high. I've never been as low as I was in that experience. So it was insane, and it never really got better. So we were in hospital for 5 days, because first child, private hospital, living the good life. We had people feeding us like round the clock, people watching to make sure our baby was okay. And that's like the ideal scenario for me. This really anxious mother that now has got a baby, not just in her belly that could die, but a baby that could die of SIDS. Like, this is where my brain is. And yeah, so we were in hospital, and every time I tried to stand up, all I could do was like get dizzy and want to vomit. And we couldn't figure out what was wrong. And the doctors were like, maybe it's blood pressure, things like that. Try and do salt, and here's some like anti-nausea pills. Looking back now, they were panic attacks over and over and over again, even in the hospital. So yeah, I didn't really stand up for 4 days. And then on the 5th day, I managed to get up and, go from the hospital. And then the same thing kept happening. I kept getting nauseous, and overwhelmed, and thinking that I was really sick and there was something wrong with me. And that's really scary when you've got anxiety, to feel like there's something wrong with you that you can't understand, and it's making you incapable of caring for your child.
Yeah. Which is such a big task anyway. Like obviously you're aware that how much effort a newborn takes, and you don't feel like you're physically capable of it, and feeling so out of control having a baby, and having like childbirth happens to you. Like, I mean, pregnancy too, but like it happens to you. Your body is a vessel and it happens whether you're there or not, which is like the definition of being out of control, let alone having to care for a baby. And then where it's almost like your needs don't matter. I mean, so this is not factual information. I should clarify. When you're sick, when you feel like you're sick on top of this, there's a sense of being out of control must have been so overwhelming.
It was terrifying. And I was so terrified because I never knew when an attack like this would happen. So this happened for 8 months, where I would feel it would just suddenly come on when I was, one time she was 3.5 months old, and I was presenting a poster in Brisbane, and I live on the Gold Coast and I have a car screamer. So it was hard just getting there because it's an hour and a half almost to drive there and back. And I was really grateful that my husband was actually able to drive us because it was a work day. And like I got through the presentation and everything like that just fine. And then we were out to lunch or something, and I just started feeling sick. And like it was just a little bit sick. And then it was more sick. And my husband wasn't there. He was somewhere else in Brisbane working. And I started to get worse and worse. And if you've ever had anxiety, you know that as things grow, your anxiety grows, which grows like the panic attack more, because at this point it wasn't sickness, it was panic attack. I just didn't know that. Yeah. And it was really lucky that I was in the lab with so we have, the lab is like my family. So we had my lab manager, Sally, and then, I was getting so sick that I needed to run to the bathroom, and Sienna, I didn't want to take her into the university bathroom, public bathroom with me. It's tiny. And Frankie just kind of walked past the door, who was one of our friends, who did his PhD with me as well. And I was like, and he just had a baby too. So his daughter is 2 weeks older than Sienna. And I was like, can you take her just for a second? And I've never left my baby with anyone. I barely even let my husband take my daughter out of my sight. And I just gave my baby to Frankie. And that's the most terrifying thing I've ever done. She was 3.5 months old, and I bolted to the bathroom, and I was trying to pull myself back together, trying to make myself feel better so I could get back to my baby, and I could hear her screaming. And it was just, all it did was make that panic attack 100 times worse. And I couldn't get control of it. And it wasn't, and because I didn't know it was a panic attack, I thought that I was really sick, and I felt completely powerless and out of control. And that is the one thing that feeds anxiety and panic attacks more than anything.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how the first 8 months of my parenting journey went. And I went back to work pretty much immediately. Like I had this really awful boss pushing me down, and like also saying, oh, your daughter should be sleeping through the night right now. Like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with her? Yeah. So like there was a bunch of things contributing to this major breakdown. One, the least of which was COVID, because Sienna was born in October of 2019. COVID lockdown started in like January or February of 2020. So just as I was exiting the newborn period with my brand new baby, like trying to like go out and do a mother's group or something, so I didn't feel so alone. Yeah. All of a sudden, the world locks down, and we're terrified because we know nothing about this virus. We're told all these really scary things. We're not allowed to like leave our houses unless it's to get groceries. And every time we bring groceries home, we have to wipe everything down with antibacterial wipes. And it was terrifying. And add on top postnatal anxiety and generalized anxiety. And I was alone. My parents couldn't touch my child. My husband's parents couldn't touch my child. Like we were making sure that no one was coming into our house and following all the rules. We didn't have any help, and she couldn't go to childcare. We were meant to get a nanny in when she turned 4.5 months old so that I could work, and I couldn't. So, and then she was a hard kid. She didn't sleep. She screamed all the time. She's highly sensitive. She was nothing like the babies that people had told me about. And I mean, logically, I knew that different temperaments existed because I'm a dev psych, but in practice, I had no idea. So I ended up in this really bad place where I was trying to work with a boss that was just pushing me to my, like, beyond my limits, in the middle of a pandemic with a child that's just highly sensitive, and highly sensitive children are really challenging as babies. And I was so sick, and I wasn't getting any sleep because my daughter wasn't sleeping very well. And it just culminated in this perfect storm that at 8 months postpartum, I was in a doctor's appointment with my doctor, We were trying to figure out what was wrong with me, why I was getting these attacks. We thought that they were vestibular or abdominal migraines. And like we were trying different medications to try and get them to stop, and it wasn't working. And I'd noticed that they were actually like coinciding with my letdown. And then I noticed that what was making me let down was actually me thinking, like, in an attack, I need to feed my baby. I hope she doesn't wake up because I'm going to have to feed her. And I feel like hell and I don't want to move. I'm so sick. I can't care for her right now. And I noticed that link, that I had those dark thoughts. They led to a letdown. And then that led to an exacerbation of the panic attack I was currently experiencing. So I turned to my doctor and I was like, what if it's anxiety? And that was the turning point for everything. But not in a good way to begin with. Because my doctor was like, yes, this makes perfect sense. It's incredible that you can be this introspective in such a bad place. I think it is. And she's like, do you want to start medication? And I was like, look, I've had this issue my whole life. I've got some really strong neural connections. I'm going to need help breaking them. So yes. Yeah. And so I went home and I took an antidepressant, just one. And I had the biggest panic attack of my life immediately afterwards. And my husband was at work and I had my baby. He'd just jumped back to work after like looking after my kids so I could go to the doctor. And I had to call him back. I had to say, you need to come back. I can't look after her. I'm having another attack. You need to look after her. And that 5-hour panic attack was hell. My brain, the thoughts in my brain were insane. They were so dark and so desperate. And it felt like it was never going to end. I'd never get on top of it. I was doing something that I don't do because my brain's too like active for that. And that was listen to guided meditations. To try and survive. And I remember thinking like, I need something. There has to be something to like take this away. And it was awful, but we were trying to figure out, we at first thought that maybe it was the antidepressant didn't agree with my system and like spiraled me into that panic attack. Now I'm pretty sure that it was simply the acknowledging that this is what it was. And I was so exhausted after 8 months of living in fight or flight mode and living in that like constant state of fatigue. I was so tired and so sick that it was like that crash was coming, and I call it a nervous breakdown because that's what it was. Yeah, it just fell apart. And the really amazing thing is that the timing that it happened, that is when you see the biggest spike in postnatal anxiety and depression is around that 9 to 12 month mark. It's not early. It's women can last about that long.
Also the highest. So in terms of timing, postpartum, it's the highest rate of maternal suicide.
Yeah, absolutely. So for 2 weeks following that massive breakdown, I was too afraid to be left alone with my daughter. So my husband had to be home all the time. He worked from home and it was COVID. So, I mean, that was a little bit lucky. And if he had to go out, someone had to come and be with me. I could not be alone with my child because I was too terrified. For that following 2 weeks, the whole time it felt like there was someone sitting on my chest, had their hands around my throat, and I was constantly nauseous. By the end of the day, every day, 5 p.m., I couldn't eat anything because it made me want to vomit, to eat something. My body was just wrecked from 8 months of living in this hellscape. But we eventually, like over those 2 weeks, it slowly got better. And I took one antidepressant because I was so afraid that that's what triggered that anxiety attack. I didn't have any more.
And then we go back to it.
No. And then we booked in to see a psychiatrist. And they're usually booked out well and truly in advance because they're a private like practitioner.
And also COVID, everyone's struggling with their own stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so I got an emergency appointment with them. And by the time I got in to see her, like I'd really clawed my way back to sanity. And I was feeling okay. I was able to be left alone with my daughter. I still couldn't take her out on my own, but I was feeling okay. I understood what the attacks were and I didn't have any more. And so by the time I got to see her, I was like, this is where I was at. This is how I'm feeling now. And then she sent me away to go and get a blood test to figure out what medication would work best with my body. I do recommend going to see a psychiatrist. And in the time between going to get that test and seeing her again, I clawed my way back to sanity enough but I didn't feel like I needed the medication. That's not where this story ends, because I do end up getting medicated, but we're going to talk about that in the second episode, which is getting help and how we recovered. But yeah, to the point where at about 9 months, I was finally starting to breathe again.
And that's where we're going to leave my story today. We're actually going to switch to Siobhan's story next week because we unwittingly took far too long delving through each of our stories. So this week you heard from me, Kristyn, all about my story. And next week we're going to talk to Siobhan about her experience, which is definitely heavier in a very different way. And then following that, we will bring you another episode the following week, all about how we recovered, all the things you need to get better, and what that looks like realistically rather than in some clear blue sky kind of world. So stay tuned. We will chat to you again next week. I can't wait to bring you Siobhan's story. See you in the next podcast. Bye.